Corrupt judge mocks man in wheelchair freezes when he stands up and reveals his true identity. The courtroom felt frozen, not from cold, but from tension so thick it pressed down on everyone. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, some leaning forward, others whispering behind their hands. Then the doors opened. Elias Monroe entered in a wheelchair. His movements were slow but controlled. His dark navy suit was sharp, precise, without flair. His expression unreadable. No fear, no plea for sympathy. His eyes stared straight ahead, cold, focused, like a blade waiting to strike. Across the room, seated high above them, all like a self-proclaimed god of justice, Judge Alton Prescott adjusted his robe and leaned forward. His fingers drummed against the polished mahogany bench, slow, rhythmic, almost theatrical. Tap, tap, tap. Then came the smile, a small curling thing that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Well," he said, his voice smooth and soaked in contempt, "this is unexpected." The room tensed. Prescott tilted his head, mockery seeping from every word. "You wheel yourself in here, expecting what? Justice?" A ripple of laughter broke the tension, first soft, then louder. A few chuckles from the gallery, a smirk from one of the jurors, a snort from the back row. No reprimands, no shame, just the shared comfort of cruelty. Elias didn't blink. He sat motionless, hands resting on his lap, as if he hadn't just been publicly humiliated, as if the comment hadn't pierced every wound left by war, loss, and betrayal. There was something unsettling in his silence, not submissive, not broken, but controlled. Like a fuse yet to be lit. Judge Prescott wasn't finished. "A man like you," he continued with a shake of his head, "should be grateful we even let you through the door. You parade yourself in here hoping to pull heartstrings, but this court doesn't bend for sob stories." The laughter resumed, louder now. One juror covered his mouth, failing to suppress a grin. Another leaned over, whispering something to the person beside him, both stifling giggles. Even the court stenographer hesitated for a second, glancing up, almost unsure whether to transcribe such venom. Still, Elias said nothing. His eyes, deep and unmoving, remained locked ahead, not at the judge, not at the crowd, but at something far beyond them. It was as if he saw through the walls, through the charade, through the entire decaying system playing dress-up with robes and rules. He wasn't there to plead, he wasn't there to beg, and he certainly wasn't there to lose. Prescott mistook silence for surrender. "You see," the judge said, shifting in his seat with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable, "this court doesn't have time for theatrics. You're accused of defrauding this country millions of dollars in benefits siphoned by a man too lazy to work, too shameless to walk, and too proud to admit it." His words struck like bullets. Too lazy to work, too shameless to walk, too proud to admit it. Each phrase hit harder than the last, and still, Elias didn't flinch. But anyone truly paying attention would have seen it. The stillness wasn't fear. It was coiled restraint. The kind of stillness a storm has before it rips the world apart. And yet, the courtroom, the judge, the prosecutor, the jurors, the audience, they all missed it. They saw a man in a wheelchair and assumed weakness. They saw dark skin and assigned guilt. They heard the word fraud and decided they didn't need facts. Because in this courtroom, truth had already been sentenced before the trial even began. Every glance thrown at Elias dripped with disdain. Every smirk was a nail hammered into the coffin they thought they'd prepared for him. He was the villain in their story, the symbol of everything they resented, but never dared to confront. And no one stood up for him. Not the public defender, who sat stiffly beside him, eyes downcast, hands trembling. Not the court officers who averted their gaze. Not even the press in the back, whose cameras zoomed in like vultures circling a dying animal. But Elias didn't need their defense, because he hadn't come here to be defended. He had come to expose. Prescott leaned back, clearly enjoying the performance. "You think you're smart, don't you? Hiding behind that chair like it gives you moral high ground. But this isn't a hospital, Mr. Monroe. It's not a VA support group. This is my courtroom." He paused. "And in my courtroom, I decide what justice looks like. For a brief moment, silence fell over the room again. Not the silence of reverence, not respect, but the quiet anticipation of cruelty, like the moment before a guillotine falls. The crowd expected Elias to break, to beg, to cry, to defend. But he gave them nothing, not because he was powerless, but because he knew none of them were ready for what he was about to do. And so he sat there, perfectly composed, like a man watching a house of cards waiting for the wind. The prosecution was relentless. Kimberly Chase, tall, poised, wrapped in the icy confidence of someone who believed truth was optional, rose from her seat like a performer taking center stage. She adjusted her blazer, cleared her throat, and approached the jury with the kind of theatrical calm that signaled a storm was coming, one of manipulation, distortion, and calculated deceit. In her hands, a thick folder, red tabs jutted out like open wounds. She held up the first document. "Exhibit A," she announced, her voice sharp and precise, slicing through the air. "Mr. Monroe's offshore bank accounts, funds traced to the Cayman Islands, over $2.4 million unreported." Gasps rippled through the gallery. She turned a page. "Exhibit B, falsified tax returns spanning 5 years. Signed, certified, dated, all with one intent: fraud." Her words fell like hammer blows. Deliberate, crippling, irrefutable to the uninformed eye. Elias Monroe remained still, but a flicker of something passed through his eyes. Not panic, not fear, recognition. He'd seen this before. This playbook, the forged evidence, the confident delivery, the bias draped in legal procedure. This wasn't truth, it was performance. Kimberly didn't stop. "Exhibit C," she said, raising a color-coded ledger. "Correspondence between Mr. Monroe and fictitious entities, shell companies designed to move money undetected." More gasps. One juror's eyes widened. Another scribbled something on their notepad. The judge leaned forward slightly, feigning impartial curiosity, but the glint in his eye betrayed him. Elias waited. Then, without a word, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single document. Just one. Thin, unassuming, but stamped in bold ink with a golden federal seal. He raised it calmly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low but clear, "this is a certified federal audit log, time-stamped, verified, and submitted to the Department of Justice 3 months ago. It directly contradicts the prosecution's claims." He held it out. Prescott didn't even glance at it. He waved his hand dismissively, like brushing away dust. "It's inadmissible," he said coldly. Elias frowned. "On what grounds?" Prescott's response was immediate, mechanical. "The court did not receive this document during preliminary proceedings. Therefore, its authenticity cannot be confirmed." "But it's a public record," Elias replied, voice steady but tightening. "Anyone with internet access and clearance can verify this." "It's not in the docket," Prescott snapped. "And if you persist, Mr. Monroe, I will hold you in contempt." The words dropped like a dagger. A murmur rolled through the gallery. People shifted in their seats. Whispered words fluttered like moths in the dark. Elias lowered the document slightly, his hand still firm. "In contempt? For presenting evidence?" he asked, quieter now but deadlier. "For trying to defend myself?" Prescott leaned forward, his voice turning sharper, more vicious. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Monroe. You do not dictate what is or isn't evidence. You do not lecture me on procedure. Is that understood?" Elias didn't respond immediately. He stared at the judge, his face composed, but his eyes burned, quietly, controlled, like a furnace sealed under glass. Finally, he placed the document on the desk before him. The room held its breath. Kimberly Chase, satisfied, returned to her seat like a lioness after the kill. The jury glanced among themselves, some confused, others clearly convinced. After all, she had brought the papers. She had shown the numbers. She had told the story. Elias had only offered one quiet contradiction, and even that had been dismissed. The system wasn't just failing him. It was designed to fail him. Elias stared down at the paper in front of him, the federal audit that could clear his name in minutes. A document more legitimate than anything Kimberly had presented. But no one would look at it. No one wanted to. Because truth wasn't welcome here. Not in this courtroom. Not with this judge. Not when the accused was a black man in a wheelchair, already judged by appearance, already condemned by bias long before the gavel ever struck. He looked up again, scanning the room not for help, but to witness it. The injustice, the cowardice, the rot hiding in plain sight. In the back row, a woman shifted uncomfortably. Next to her, a man leaned forward, frowning. The whispers had grown louder. Not outrage, but uncertainty. Doubt was creeping in. Prescott banged his gavel once. Silence in the courtroom. But silence wouldn't save him now. Elias cleared his throat, not to speak, but to reclaim his presence. He looked the jury straight in the eye, not with desperation, but with clarity. If the truth is too inconvenient to be heard, he said slowly, then this isn't a courtroom, it's a stage. Objection! Chase shot to her feet. Sustained, Prescott barked. One more word, Mr. Monroe, and I will remove you from these proceedings. As the judge dismissed his evidence with a flick of the wrist, Elias lowered his gaze, not in defeat, but because something deeper had stirred. A memory, a place far from this courtroom, a battlefield. Long before they called him a fraud, the world had once called him a hero. The thunder of gunfire echoed through the scorched valley. Dust rose in thick, choking waves, masking the sun, smothering every breath. Chaos crackled in Elias Monroe's earpiece as orders clashed with screams, and explosions turned coordinates into ash. The ambush had been sudden, brutal. What was supposed to be a routine patrol had spiraled into hell. But Elias didn't run. He never ran. Pinned behind a shattered Humvee, his squad scattered, and enemy fire raining down from the ridgelines, Elias heard the screams. Not soldiers. Civilians. Trapped in the village center, caught in the crossfire. Women clutching children. Elders crawling for cover. Innocents. Forgotten in the hailstorm of bullets. He didn't hesitate. Slinging his rifle over his shoulder, Elias broke cover. Monroe, get back! Someone shouted into his comms. That's a kill zone. But it was already too late. Elias was sprinting head low, steps precise, weaving through bursts of gunfire like a ghost made of muscle and will. Dirt exploded around his boots. A bullet clipped his shoulder, sent blood spraying across his fatigues. He didn't stop. Not for the pain, not for the fear, not for himself. He reached the first house, roof caved in, walls riddled with shrapnel. A little girl screamed inside, trapped under a wooden beam. Elias dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp sting of his own wounds, and lifted. Tendons screamed, bones trembled, but the beam rose just enough for her to crawl out. He shielded her with his body as another round of shots cracked overhead. He handed her off to a panicked mother. Go! He barked, pointing toward the evacuation corridor they'd barely cleared earlier. Then he turned back. 2 more houses, 3 more civilians. His uniform was soaked with sweat and blood, his movements slowed by pain, his vision blurred, but Elias kept going, like a machine carved from duty. Not because he was ordered to, but because something inside him refused to leave anyone behind. And then it happened. The mortar struck too close. The blast hurled him into the air, his body smashing into a crumbling brick wall. The sound was muffled, surreal, like thunder underwater. Pain screamed through every nerve as he hit the ground, his legs twisting at an angle no human body should ever make. For a second, everything was silent. Time froze. Then came the agony, white-hot, paralyzing. He tried to crawl. Nothing. His legs were done. The radio crackled to life. Monroe is down. Repeat. Monroe is down. But he didn't black out. He wouldn't allow it, because from where he lay, he could still see them civilians running, escaping, getting out. Because of him. Because he went back when no one else would. And that was enough. They called him a hero. When Elias finally returned stateside, months later, wrapped in scars and silence, he was greeted by brass, cameras, and claps that didn't match the depth of his sacrifice. There was a medal. Of course there was. Silver Star. A ceremony. A framed picture. A 2-minute segment on the evening news. And then, nothing. The world moved on. The generals got promotions. The reporters found another story. The politician shook his hand, smiled for the cameras, and vanished. Elias, now bound to a wheelchair, faded quietly into the margins of society. The VA sent forms. The hospital sent bills. Job applications were lost in a system that never saw past his injuries. No parades, no career offers, no second chances, just silence, just pain. He'd given everything, his health, his future, his body, for a country that now walked past him in grocery stores like he didn't exist. Sometimes people would glance down at the wheelchair, then quickly look away. Pity was fleeting, but suspicion, that lingered. Must have done something wrong to end up like that, someone once whispered at a DMV line. Bet he's milking the system, another muttered outside a pharmacy. And just like that, Elias Monroe, war hero, lifesaver, soldier, became something else. And now Elias Monroe sat in a courtroom, not as a hero, but as a man accused, while the nation he once protected turned its back without hesitation. At the center of it all, Judge Alton Prescott leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench like a king surveying the pitiful. His voice, calm but cutting, sliced through the courtroom like a blade dipped in poison. "I see your medals, Mr. Monroe," he said, eyes narrowing. "I see the ribbons, the citations, the commendations. Impressive, really." He paused, then delivered the punchline with a smirk. "But a medal can't hide a lie. Valor doesn't erase crime. Your past doesn't grant you immunity." The room remained still. Even the air felt like it held its breath, waiting for Elias to defend himself, to rise in outrage, to hurl back the injustice that soaked every word. But Elias didn't move. Not a twitch. Not a blink. His expression remained as unreadable as ever, still, cold, impenetrable. And that stillness, it infuriated them more than any outburst could have, because silence, when held by a man like Elias, became defiance. It was the silence of a man who had already faced death and didn't fear small men in robes pretending to be gods. Prescott wasn't finished. "Oh, you'll play the veteran card," he said, waving toward Elias dismissively. "You'll tell us stories of heroism, of how you bled for this country. But here's what I see, Mr. Monroe." He pointed a finger directly at him. "I see a man hiding behind sacrifice, hiding behind a wheelchair. A man who once did his duty, yes, but then got addicted to praise, addicted to sympathy, and eventually addicted to money." A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. The gallery was quiet, but the silence was no longer passive. It pulsed with something darker: judgment, fed not by fact, but by the way Elias refused to explain himself, the way he refused to perform for them. A woman in the second row whispered, "He should at least say something." But Elias didn't know them words. He had already given them blood. His hands, resting calmly on his lap, were the same hands that once dragged civilians out of burning rubble. His legs, now lifeless, had once run through hell to carry others to safety. And his silence, his unbearable, unbreakable silence, was the last armor he had left. Still, the judge kept striking. "You had everything this country could give," Prescott continued, voice rising, just enough to fill the room. "You had honor. You had a future. And now you come before us, accused of siphoning thousands in disability benefits you no longer deserve. You call that justice?" He didn't wait for an answer. "You're not the first soldier to come back broken," he sneered, "but you might be the first to weaponize your brokenness." That was the moment something shifted, not in Elias, but in the room itself. The gallery began to stir. Whispers turned into sharp exhales. Faces contorted in confusion and doubt. This wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle. And Elias was being publicly dismantled, piece by piece, by a man who wore authority like armor and used it like a club. Still, Elias said nothing. Not because he was weak, but because every time he had spoken in the past, no one had listened. Not when he applied for jobs and was told he was too damaged to hire. Not when the VA misplaced his records twice. Not when the benefits he rightfully earned were delayed for months with no explanation. And certainly not now, when his silence was more powerful than any testimony he could give. Prescott leaned back in his chair, the echo of his insults still hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. The prosecutor, Kimberly Chase, nodded slightly. lips curled in satisfaction. Her case didn't need evidence anymore. The room had already been poisoned by doubt. Elias wasn't just fighting charges. He was fighting perception, and perception always obeyed power. "Your Honor," his public defender finally mumbled, clearly shaken. "I believe my client would—" Prescott raised a hand. "Enough. We've heard the stories. We've seen the records. We've looked at the medals. But we are here to judge now, not then." And just like that, the man who had once saved lives under fire was labeled a burden, a liar, a disgrace. And so, with truth buried and justice gagged, all that remained was the final blow. There was no debate, no deliberation, no pause to question the mountain of holes in the prosecution story, no acknowledgement of the evidence Elias Monroe had tried beg to present. The judge hadn't even looked at it. The jury never saw it. The defense, underpaid and unprepared, didn't dare push further. Justice wasn't just blind in this room. It had been gagged, bound, and shoved in the corner. Elias sat in his wheelchair, surrounded by the machinery of a system designed to devour men like him. Men who didn't look the part. Men who didn't speak the way they wanted. Men who didn't bow when accused. Across the room, Judge Alton Prescott adjusted his robe like a king about to deliver a royal decree, not a verdict. His voice, when it came, was calm, deliberate like a blade being slowly drawn from its sheath. "Elias Monroe," he said, leaning forward, savoring the silence, "you are hereby found guilty on all counts." The words struck like gunfire. No gasp, no outcry, just silence, dead, suffocating silence. And then, the shift. A woman in the gallery inhaled sharply. A man near the back blinked, stunned. A juror's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered softly against the wood. Even the prosecutor, Kimberly Chase, couldn't quite hide the flicker of surprise in her eyes. The trial had ended so abruptly, so cleanly, it almost felt rehearsed, like the ending had been written before the story began. Elias didn't move, didn't protest, didn't shout, didn't even blink. But the courtroom felt different now. Something had changed, not visibly, not loudly, but undeniably, like the air before a lightning strike. Static, tight, electric. Prescott continued, completely unaware he was sitting on a fault line. "This court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison," he said, "effective immediately. 12 years for a man who had once given up the use of his legs to save civilians under fire. 12 years for a man whose only crime was trusting a country that now pretended not to know his name. And all of it decided in minutes. No cross-examination, no full review of evidence, no time for truth to breathe. It was as if Elias Monroe had been convicted the moment he rolled into the courtroom." A juror leaned forward slightly, her lips barely moving. "That's not right," she whispered. Another voice from the back, low, uneasy. "He didn't even get to defend himself." And still, Elias Monroe sat motionless at the defense table, head bowed, hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair, as still as a statue carved from stone in silence. No twitch of anger, no protest of innocence, no visible pain. He didn't cry, he didn't tremble, he didn't even breathe heavily. It was the kind of silence that screamed louder than words, the kind that unsettled the guilty. Prescott glanced down from the bench, uneasy now. His gavel rested in his hand, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a symbol of power. It felt fragile, like a toy in the wrong moment. And then Elias moved. It was small at first, barely perceptible. A shift in his fingers, the tightening of knuckles around the metal armrest, a subtle straightening of his back. Nothing dramatic, nothing fast, but enough. Enough to make one of the bailiffs stiffen, enough to draw every eye in the room like magnets to steel. And then, slowly and possibly, Elias began to stand. One breath, one motion, and gravity shifted. His knees locked, his spine uncoiled. Inch by deliberate inch, he rose not with a surge of drama, but with the terrifying calm of inevitability. The courtroom gasped in one voice. A woman clutched her chest. A juror gripped the edge of the box. A reporter's pen dropped to the floor, rolling to a stop like punctuation to the impossible. Because the man they had mocked, the man they had called a fraud, the man they had accused of faking everything, was now standing, on his own 2 feet, tall, balanced, unshaken. Judge Prescott stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled backward. "What is this?" he barked. "Mr. Monroe, sit down immediately." But Elias didn't sit. He didn't even look at the judge. He looked out across the courtroom, at every face, every eye that had stared at him with pity, suspicion, or scorn. He looked at the jury that condemned him, the prosecutor who built a case of lies, the crowd that watched his character burn in silence. And then, in the voice of a man who had carried too much pain for too long, he finally spoke. "You've all had your say," Elias said softly. "Now it's my turn." He stood tall, steady, and terrifyingly calm. Elias Monroe, the man they had dragged through lies, paraded as a fraud, humiliated in front of the world, now stood on his own 2 feet unshaken. And as he took his first step forward, the sound of his polished shoes clicking against the courtroom floor landed with the force of gunshots. 1, 2, 3. Each step louder than the last. He walked not like a man returning from defeat, but like a man who had always known exactly how this would end. The courtroom was frozen, suspended between disbelief and dread. Prescott's lips parted, but no sound came. His gavel, once slammed with certainty, now trembled in his grasp. What are you doing?" the judge managed to stammer. Elias didn't answer. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't need to. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. One smooth motion, controlled, measured, dangerous not because it was sudden, but because it was inevitable. "Get back!" one bailiff shouted, stepping forward, hand hovering over his holster. A gasp swept through the gallery. Panic was rising like a wave about to crest. But Elias wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a leather badge case, snapped it open with a quiet but unmistakable click. And there it was. The golden emblem gleamed beneath the courtroom lights. Etched in bold across its face, United States Department of Justice. A wave of pure silence hit the room. Then chaos, screams, shouts, scraping chairs. Cameras dropped. A woman clutched her chest. A man stumbled back, knocking over a bench as he whispered, "No, that can't be." Even the prosecutor stood frozen, mouth ajar, unable to speak. Her hands trembled as the truth unraveled in front of her. Elias took another step forward, his voice like steel wrapped in fire. "My name is Special Agent Elias Monroe," he said. "DOJ Internal Affairs." Every word detonated like a charge. "Special Agent?" Prescott echoed, voice cracking. "You just convicted a federal agent," Elias said coldly, "based on falsified documents, suppressed evidence, and orchestrated perjury." He paused, letting that truth hang like a guillotine. "And you did it so quickly, so easily because you believed I couldn't stand." Prescott stumbled back, knocking into his chair. This is a stunt. This is contempt of court," he yelled. Elias stared at him. "No," he said. "This is accountability." Behind Elias, several people in the gallery stood slowly, deliberately, suits straightened, badges raised. From the back row, from the sides of the courtroom, even from the jury box itself. One by one, they revealed themselves. Federal agents, plainclothes, embedded, and now activated. Prescott's hands began to shake. "This is my courtroom," he roared. "I demand you all sit down." But no one obeyed. The very walls of power he had hidden behind were crumbling in real time. "Judge Prescott," Elias said, his voice steady and sharp, "you no longer control this courtroom." The words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, the room seemed frozen in time. Faces turned, eyes widened. No one breathed. The man they had mocked, silenced, and labeled a fraud had just stripped the most powerful figure in the room of his authority in front of everyone. Prescott's smirk faltered. The judge, who had sneered through the entire trial, now leaned forward, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "What did you just say?" he asked, but his voice was quieter now, uncertain. Elias took one slow step forward, and the sound of his footstep echoed like a warning shot. "I said," he repeated, "you no longer control this courtroom." Gone was the deference. Gone was the pretense. Elias wasn't asking for justice anymore. He was justice. Prescott's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but all he saw were faces twisted in confusion, in fear, in realization. The very room that once celebrated his authority now recoiled from it. The illusion had shattered. "You're out of line," Prescott snapped, voice rising in desperation. "You're disrupting my court." "Your court?" Elias said, his voice edged with steel. "This was never your court. It's the people's. And they're watching now?" He motioned toward the gallery, toward the agents, the cameras, the phones now recording every moment, every lie, every failure of the system Prescott had used to ruin lives. The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped the bench. "This is a trick. You're bluffing. You're not who you say you are." But he was, and the fear in Prescott's voice betrayed it. Elias raised his badge once more, the golden seal of the Department of Justice gleaming beneath the courtroom lights. "I'm Special Agent Elias Monroe, Internal Affairs, and you're under investigation." A collective gasp rippled across the gallery. Prescott stepped back, unsteady, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath him. The confidence drained from his face, replaced by something he had never shown: vulnerability. The man who had laughed in the face of truth, who had silenced the voiceless, now stood cornered. And Elias didn't have to shout. He didn't need to rage. Because the truth, when finally unleashed, didn't need force. It only needed space. Elias had seized that space, and the courtroom would never be the same. For a heartbeat, the courtroom stood in silence, caught between disbelief and something far more dangerous: revelation. Then, one by one, they rose. A woman in the gallery, dressed like an ordinary spectator, stood slowly and pulled back her blazer to reveal a badge. FBI. Across the room, a man on the jury box, juror number 6, stood as well. He reached into his inner coat pocket and lifted a leather case. DOJ. Next, the stenographer removed her headset, pushed away from her station, and calmly displayed her own federal identification. DOJ, Internal Affairs. It was a domino effect of chaos massed in order. From the far corners of the courtroom, from the back row, even from the aisle near the exits, figures who had seemed like mere bystanders now stood shoulder to shoulder, raising identical badges. FBI, DOJ, Internal Affairs. The deception unraveled all at once. Gasps tore through the room. Someone dropped a phone. A man cursed under his breath. A woman in the second row clutched her handbag and whispered, "My God, they were here the whole time." The gallery, which moments before had watched Elias Monroe as nothing more than a defendant, now saw him in an entirely new light. And he wasn't finished. Elias stepped forward, his voice like a blade drawn from fire. Clear, commanding, unstoppable. He pulled a sealed folder from his suit coat stamped with the official seal of the United States Department of Justice and held it high. "Judge Alton Prescott," Elias declared, his tone echoing like a war drum through the courtroom. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery, and abuse of judicial authority." The room froze. Prescott stood behind his bench, white-knuckled, face drained of color. He looked to his bailiffs, who were no longer his. He looked to the jury, half of whom were now standing, badges in hand. He looked to the gallery, but they only stared back with horror or awe. You think you can do this?" Prescott snapped, his voice cracked with panic. "This is my courtroom." Elias didn't blink. "Not anymore," he replied. "This is a setup," Prescott roared, the gavel shaking in his hand. "You have no jurisdiction here. I'm a judge. You can't arrest me." "You were a judge," Elias said coldly. "Now you're a suspect in a federal investigation." "No!" Prescott shouted, slamming his gavel onto the bench. "I am the law. I decide what justice looks like in this courtroom." "Correction," Elias said, stepping closer. "You decided what injustice looked like." Two agents began to move. Prescott backed away instinctively, like a cornered animal. His face was slick with sweat, his breaths rapid and shallow. He stumbled against his own bench, as if looking for something, anything to hold on to. "Don't come near me," he screamed. "This is a mistake." First agent reached the steps of the bench. "I'll call the governor. I'll shut this whole operation down, Prescott yelled, his voice nearly unhinged. You can't do this. I own this room. But the courtroom no longer responded to his authority, because his words for the first time carried no weight. They were hollow, exposed, powerless. The second agent reached him, calm, firm, silent. No! Prescott bellowed one last time. Click. The sound of handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed louder than any gavel he had ever slammed. The man who once ruled with unchecked authority now stood with trembling hands bound in steel, his judge's robe draping over slumped shoulders like a fallen curtain. The agents turned him to face the courtroom. His courtroom, and the silence that met him was not one of respect, but of justice finally reclaiming its place. Elias watched, steady and unblinking. There was no gloating in his eyes, no triumph, only clarity and something deeper, resolve. Because this wasn't vengeance, it was restoration. Prescott, now in full panic, looked one last time toward Elias. You planned this. All of it, he whispered. Yes, Elias answered, and I waited. I endured your lies, your humiliation, your courtroom charade. I let you bury me because I needed you to believe you'd won. The former judge was escorted down the aisle, past the rows of people he had once judged from on high. But now those people looked at him not with fear, but with vindication. A woman near the back wiped away tears. A young man nodded slowly, fists clenched. Someone whispered, "It's finally over." But Elias knew better. This was only the beginning. As the doors closed behind Prescott, the agents forming a wall around him, Elias turned to face the gallery. His voice cut through the air, calm and resolute. This was never just about me. This was about every person who walked into this room and left with less than they deserved. Today, we didn't just remove a corrupt judge. We reclaimed something greater, justice itself. The room stood still, not with fear, but with respect. Elias stepped back, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as purpose fulfilled. And in that moment, no one doubted who truly held the gavel now. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The courtroom was still humming with the aftershock of Judge Prescott's arrest when Elias Monroe turned toward the officers surrounding the bench. Secure the judge's chambers, he said with quiet authority. No one in, no one out. Two agents nodded immediately, disappearing through the side doors. Elias walked with purpose now. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. The trap had been sprung, but the trap was just the beginning. What mattered now was the evidence, the truth, the rot underneath the robe. Bring in the tech team, he ordered into his comm. Full sweep. We're cracking this wide open. The side hallway filled with movement federal agents in tactical gear, forensic analysts, DOJ cybercrime specialists. They moved swiftly and silently, like they'd been rehearsing this for months. In reality, they had. Elias stood outside Prescott's chambers for a moment before entering. The door creaked open, revealing a room drenched in dark wood and deeper secrets. Books lined the shelves, most for show. Certificates framed on the wall proclaimed honor. But honor was just the wallpaper hiding corruption. The agents immediately got to work. One opened the judge's desk drawer and pulled out a sleek black laptop. Password protected, but not for long. Another lifted a drawer panel and found a hidden USB drive taped beneath. In the closet, they found a locked cabinet. Elias picked up a crowbar and cracked it open. Inside were files, dozens of them. He pulled the first one out. It was a list, typed, printed, organized. Names, case numbers, sentences, notes scribbled in the margins. Elias frowned. He scanned the list. Every one of these defendants had something in common. Unusually harsh sentences, often against court recommendations. Minor offenses, first-time offenders. Some were juveniles. On the top corner of the sheet was a handwritten label. Pressure list. He didn't need to guess what that meant. Agent Monroe, a tech called out from the desk. We've got access to the laptop. Show me, Elias said, walking over. The screen lit up with file folders. Most were blandly labeled. Court admin, scheduling, financial. But one folder caught his eye immediately. It was named Private C, password locked. "I need that open now," Elias said. A few keystrokes later, it cracked. And what unfolded was worse than anyone could have imagined. Hundreds of emails, dozens of spreadsheets, audio files, payment records, case strategy notes, all of it linked directly to Prescott and Kimberly Chase. Elias opened the first email chain. The subject line read, "Re-favor on sentencing account transfer complete." Inside, a thread between Prescott and Chase discussing an upcoming case. Attached was a wire transfer receipt, $75,000 deposited into a Cayman Islands account. Elias opened another. This time it was a forwarded email from Chase to Prescott. "He's not pushing back. We can give him 15 years and close the file." The defendant? A 19-year-old who had pled guilty to petty theft. The spreadsheet attached listed payments made by a private prison contractor. Names highlighted in green marked the targets. Beside each, a dollar value, a sentence length, a timestamp. It was a price list for lives. "God," one of the analysts muttered behind Elias. "This isn't just corruption, it's an operation." Elias nodded, his jaw tight. "Keep digging," he said. "I want every file, every trace." Another agent called from the far side of the room. "Sir, we found the burner phones, hidden in the wall panel." Elias walked over. There were 6 phones, cheap, unregistered. One was still powered on. The call log showed frequent contact with an encrypted number linked to a known shell corporation. The corporation's name, Lexor Strategic Consulting, a company long suspected of funneling bribes to compromise public officials. Now there was proof. Elias turned to his team. "Bag and tag everything. I want this building locked down tighter than a vault." He stepped into the hallway as a rolling cart passed by, stacked high with confiscated hard drives, document boxes, and sealed evidence bags. In that moment, Elias didn't feel victorious. He felt vindicated but not satisfied, because every folder in that room represented someone who had been silenced, someone who had faced a gavel without a chance, someone who had been condemned by a man playing God with people's futures. He walked out to the main courtroom, where the remaining spectators still sat in stunned silence. He climbed the steps of the judge's bench not as an act of arrogance, but of restoration. He looked out over the room, raised one of the files, and spoke with calm fury. "This file contains the names of over 50 people sentenced unjustly by Judge Prescott for profit, for influence, for deals made in the dark." Murmurs rose from the crowd, gasps, cries, the beginning of something powerful. "There are more," Elias continued, "dozens more. Cases will be reopened, convictions overturned, and those responsible, every last one, will face trial." Someone stood in the gallery and began to applaud. Then another, and another. It wasn't celebration, it was release. Elias stepped down, met with agents flooding in from every direction. Justice was no longer a concept trapped in the mouth of the guilty, it was alive, walking, speaking, reclaiming. And this was just the beginning. The courtroom was no longer a place of law. It had become a crime scene. The gavel was gone, the judge was in cuffs, and the illusion of order had shattered into something raw and unfiltered. Truth. But not everyone was ready to face it. At the far end of the room, as agents flooded in and evidence carts rolled out, Kimberly Chase, the once confident prosecutor, moved quietly toward the side exit. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, every step calculated. She kept her head low, her hair falling like a curtain, trying to blend in. Her designer briefcase hung at her side, clenched tightly in her hand, not with grace, but with desperation. She didn't run. Not yet. But her eyes were scanning for gaps, looking for weakness in the web that was now closing in. She made it halfway to the door. Then a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Stop right there!" Agent Ramirez, tall, sharp-eyed, in full DOJ gear, stepped directly into her path. Chase froze. For half a second, she considered playing dumb, but it was too late. Behind her, Elias Monroe had turned, his gaze locked on her with calm precision. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He just spoke. "Kimberly Chase," he said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "You're not going anywhere." The gallery turned as one. The woman who had stood in court day after day, waving falsified documents and fabricating truths, now looked like a child caught in a house of mirrors collapsing around her. "No," she muttered under her breath. Not like this. And then she ran. The briefcase dropped. Papers spilled. Her heels echoed in a rapid staccato as she bolted down the hall, shoulder-checking a stunned clerk on the way. Two agents were on her in seconds. Go! One barked. She veered hard right toward the emergency stairwell, but the door flung open from the other side. A female agent emerged, blocking the way. Chase tried to pivot, slipped, hit the wall, and stumbled backward into the waiting arms of the agents. They pinned her with practiced ease. Cuffs clicked. She thrashed once, twice, then sagged with the realization. The escape had failed. This is a mistake, she shouted. I was following orders. You think I wanted this? Elias stepped into the hallway, calm and composed. No, he said. You wanted power, and you sold your soul for it. Her expression flickered between rage and desperation. You have no idea what I was up against. Do you know how deep this goes? Yes, Elias replied. That's why you're just the beginning. Back in the courtroom, the chaos hadn't stopped. Another agent had stepped toward the court clerk's desk. Ma'am, step away from the keyboard, he instructed. The clerk hesitated, hands hovering over her terminal. She was shaking, but not from fear, from guilt. The agent leaned in. We have emails, bank transfers, phone recordings. If you cooperate now, we talk leniency. She nodded once and placed her wrists together. Click. The sound of another set of handcuffs. To the left, a bailiff who had stood motionless through most of the trial, now slowly backed toward the wall. Sweat lined his collar. He was trying to disappear into the paneling. Hey, an agent called. Stay where you are. But the bailiff turned and made a break for it only 2 steps before 3 agents tackled him to the floor. A brief struggle, shouts, then silence as he was hauled to his feet, wrists bound, face bloodless. Elias walked back into the courtroom to find 4 court staff members already in custody. The people who had once sat behind the scenes, pushing buttons and pulling strings, now sat on the floor, backs against the wall, eyes hollow with realization. You all thought you were untouchable, Elias said, his voice like iron wrapped in truth. You thought wearing a badge or sitting behind a desk made you immune. But justice doesn't stop at titles. It never did. One of the gallery spectators whispered. They were all in on it. All this time. A ripple of shock passed through the crowd, followed by something deeper. Rage. These were the people entrusted to serve justice, and they had twisted it into something monstrous. One of the arrested court assistants, young, barely in her 20s, looked up at Elias with trembling eyes. I just typed what they told me, she said softly. I didn't know what I was part of. That's the problem, Elias said. Too many didn't want to know. More agents entered with evidence bags, USB drives, shredded documents, burner phones, financial ledgers. Every piece of it painted the same picture: a courtroom turned into a criminal enterprise, a justice system hijacked by ambition, ego, and greed. Kimberly Chase was seated now, her wrists shackled, head down. She didn't speak anymore. Prescott had tried to rule by fear. Chase had tried to run with lies. But in the end, truth had outrun them all. Elias stood at the center of it, surrounded by the shattered remains of their empire. He wasn't smiling. There was no satisfaction, only resolve. Because this wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. And the reckoning wasn't over yet. But when the mask came off and the handcuffs snapped shut, what unraveled next wasn't just a trial, it was an entire empire of lies collapsing in real time. It was like watching a cathedral crumble slow at first, then all at once. The courtroom, once a symbol of ironclad authority, had become a battlefield of shattered illusions. The air hung thick with tension, charged with the static of disbelief and awakening. The very foundation of a system built on fear, manipulation, and unchecked power was beginning to collapse right in front of everyone, and no one could stop it. Bailiffs in cuffs, court clerks being let out the door, a prosecutor sitting silently, her once arrogant stare now empty. A judge, moments ago, a god in robes, shackled and trembling like a prisoner of his own crimes. These weren't just isolated arrests, they were tremors of something larger. A fault line that had run deep beneath the marble floors for years was finally splitting wide open. Spectators in the gallery watched in stunned silence. their eyes darting between federal agents, fallen officials, and Elias Monroe, the man who had walked in as a defendant and now stood as a reckoning. Some whispered to one another, others wept quietly. One man muttered, "I thought justice lived here." And in that moment, he voiced what they all felt, a betrayal of trust so complete, it left the soul shaking. The courtroom, the sanctuary where truth was supposed to triumph, had been a stage for lies. And now the masks were gone. Elias moved through the wreckage, not with triumph, but with unwavering purpose. He wasn't here to celebrate. He was here to dismantle what had masqueraded as justice for far too long. "Look around," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This is what happens when the law serves power instead of the people. When those sworn to protect justice use it as a weapon. When the truth is sold to the highest bidder." Every word struck like a hammer against the already crumbling walls of denial. Federal agents moved with clockwork efficiency, tagging evidence, logging statements, interviewing shocked staff who had once believed they were safe simply because they played their roles. But no one was safe anymore, not from the truth. One agent uncovered a hidden drawer inside the judge's chambers. Inside, sealed envelopes full of cash, names scribbled in shorthand, case numbers clipped to them like footnotes to a transaction. Each envelope was a life. Each number was a person who had been robbed of freedom, crushed by sentences delivered not from the law, but from greed. Elias took one of the envelopes in his hand and stared at it. "This is what justice cost in this room," he said bitterly. $30,000 for a man's future. No one spoke, because what could they say? The myth of the courtroom had fallen apart. It had always looked untouchable, like stone pillars standing against time. But inside it had been hollowed out, rotted from within. And now exposed to the light, it was falling. Piece by piece, step by step. Collapse wasn't loud, it was cold, precise, final. And Elias Monroe, once a silenced veteran, once mocked, once bound by a wheelchair, stood at the center of it. Not as a survivor, but as the storm itself. The system didn't fall because of violence. It fell because truth stood up and refused to sit down again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The courtroom doors swung open with a heavy, resonant creak. Elias Monroe stepped out into blinding daylight, the harsh glare piercing his eyes after hours beneath the sterile fluorescence inside. For a moment, he stood motionless at the top of the marble steps, letting his vision adjust. Around him, federal agents hurried in and out, boxes overflowing with documents, computers and phones, all dripping evidence of the corruption that had ruled within those walls for far too long. But it wasn't the agents or evidence that gripped Elias's attention. It was the crowd. Hundreds of people had gathered outside, faces etched with lines of hardship, weariness, and suppressed anger. Men and women, young and old, clutching faded photographs and worn court documents like sacred relics. They stood shoulder to shoulder, silent but expectant. Their eyes followed every step Elias took, as if each movement held a fragile hope they'd carried quietly for years. He descended the courthouse steps slowly, deliberately, each footfall echoing off the stone beneath him. Silence enveloped the crowd, a collective holding of breath, uncertain whether to cheer or weep. They'd seen too many promises broken, too many hopes shattered by men in positions of power who believed they were untouchable. Halfway down, Elias paused. His gaze swept over the crowd, connecting briefly with countless faces, each bearing a story of injustice, pain, and loss. Yet beneath that pain, he saw resilience, a quiet, defiant strength born from enduring the unbearable. In them, Elias recognized himself. He reached the bottom step. Before he could speak, a ripple moved through the crowd, and a figure emerged, a frail, elderly woman, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a faded scarf. She approached with hesitant steps, tears streaming unchecked down wrinkled cheeks. Her trembling hands clutched an old black and white photograph, the edges yellowed by time. Elias recognized her immediately from the files he'd studied, one of Prescott's earliest victims. Her son had been sentenced unjustly, stolen away by a system that valued influence over truth. She had written hundreds of letters, knocked on dozens of doors. Nobody had listened. Until now. She stopped inches from Elias, eyes searching his face, as if reassuring herself that he was real. "My boy," she whispered, her voice thin but charged with years of agony. "They took him away from me. He never came home." Elias reached out gently, laying a comforting hand on her shoulder. She clutched his wrist tightly, as though anchoring herself to something solid after decades adrift. Leaning in, she whispered softly, her voice trembling yet determined, words carrying the weight of a lifetime. "You did what no one else dared." The crowd around them murmured softly, the woman's whispered gratitude resonating through each person like an echo long overdue. Slowly, she stepped back, clutching the photograph to her heart as if holding the son she'd lost again. Elias felt the weight of her words, simple yet profound. He had done what needed to be done, but he had not done it alone. Each face before him represented courage, quiet endurance, defiance in the face of a corrupted power. And it was for them that he now stood. Elias straightened, taking a deep breath. He spoke clearly, with a voice tempered by hardship but filled with unwavering conviction. "This was never just about me." His words cut through the quiet afternoon air like a blade, clear and resonant, reaching every ear. It was about all of us, about every person standing here today, and every person who couldn't be here, those who were silenced, ignored, forgotten. It was about exposing the system that told us justice existed while denying it to those who needed it most. The fight doesn't end here. He paused, locking eyes with individuals in the crowd. This is only the beginning. A murmur of agreement spread through the gathered mass. Nods, tears, clenched fists raised in quiet affirmation. His voice rose slightly, conviction amplifying each syllable. "We've torn down one corrupt judge, one broken courtroom. But the corruption, the injustice, it reaches further than one man. It thrives where silence rules. Today, we refuse to be silent. Today, we take back justice." The crowd erupted applause, rolling like thunder through the plaza, rising, resonating off every brick and stone. People hugged, some openly weeping, releasing emotions bottled for years. Others stood proudly, holding up documents as evidence of battles long fought alone, but finally heard. Elias watched them for a long moment, absorbing the weight of responsibility that now rested firmly upon his shoulders. He knew this was no single victory, it was the first spark of a wildfire. He turned toward a waiting SUV. Agents flanked him, quietly respectful, knowing the moment belonged to him and the people who stood behind him. Inside the vehicle, Elias closed his eyes briefly, savoring a fleeting moment of peace. But the silence didn't last. The driver's voice broke gently through his thoughts. "Sir, they're waiting for you at the Capitol." Elias nodded, eyes opening slowly. It was time. 2 weeks later, Elias stood again, this time before a packed congressional hearing. Cameras clicked relentlessly, flashes like lightning bolts capturing a historic moment. Senators and representatives stared down from the raised dais, faces tense with anticipation, and for some, barely concealed anxiety. The very foundations of power and privilege felt suddenly unstable beneath their polished shoes. Elias spoke without hesitation, his voice measured but authoritative. "For decades, we've allowed the justice system to be weaponized against the powerless. Judges, prosecutors, officials who saw courtrooms as their personal playgrounds, innocent lives as currency to trade for personal gain. Today, we draw a line in the sand." Senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One older representative cleared his throat nervously. Elias continued undeterred. "You trusted me to root out corruption, but removing one judge, even one courthouse full of compromised staff, isn't enough. We must acknowledge that the roots of this corruption run deeper into our courts, into our laws, into how justice itself is administered. Our system requires not just accountability, but complete, uncompromising reform." His eyes moved methodically around the room, resting briefly on each lawmaker present. He read their discomfort, recognized the fear of upheaval in their faces. They understood change was coming, and Elias would not be swayed by power, influence, or tradition. It is with humility, but absolute determination, that I accept the responsibility you've given me to lead the complete reform of our judicial system, to make justice truly blind not to the truth, but to power and privilege, to ensure that never again can a courthouse become a marketplace for injustice. Silence gripped the chamber, tension so palpable, even breathing felt difficult. Then gradually, applause broke out. Slow, scattered at first, growing stronger until the room shook with the force of acknowledgement. Senators stood, members of Congress joined in, staffers raised their voices, the entire room united, at least momentarily, behind the monumental change Elias had vowed to lead. Elias nodded once in acknowledgement, feeling a rush of certainty in his heart. This was no small fight, but then he had never chosen small fights. From battlefields overseas, to corrupted courtrooms, to the very halls of power, Elias Monroe had faced injustice head-on, without flinching. As the applause subsided, the hearing chair spoke solemnly, voice thick with respect. "Agent Monroe, today marks the beginning of a new era. You have our support." Elias stood tall, the resolve etched deep into his features. "Thank you," he replied simply, powerfully. "Now let's get to work." That evening, alone in his office, Elias watched the city lights stretch endlessly beyond his window, millions of lives, countless struggles, hopes, dreams, injustices, waiting silently to be corrected. He felt a familiar weight on his chest, the enormity of what lay ahead. But he didn't fear it, because he wasn't alone. He carried within him the strength of every person who had stood outside the courthouse, of every injustice he'd uncovered, every silent voice finally given power. He thought again of the elderly woman who'd whispered to him, "You did what no one else dared." Her words were his armor, her courage his inspiration, and he knew deeply, undeniably, that justice had found its voice, and this voice could never again be silenced. Justice is never guaranteed, it must be demanded, fought for, reclaimed from the hands of those who would corrupt it. This was the harsh lesson Elias Monroe learned, first in battle overseas, and again in the cold, marble halls of a courtroom meant to protect truth, but instead had become a weapon wielded by the powerful. Elias's struggle began as the struggle of one man, a hero who risked his life on foreign soil, returned home decorated, but quickly forgotten. He faced injustice head-on, silently enduring the ridicule, the scorn, and the betrayal from those who should have stood with him. The insults he endured, the evidence fabricated against him, the verdict predetermined, all of it served to demonstrate a bitter truth. Even a hero could be silenced if he threatened the system built on lies and corruption. Yet Elias Monroe's silence was never defeat, it was strategy. The real message echoed through every twist and turn of Elias's journey. No injustice can survive indefinitely when confronted with relentless courage. Elias understood deeply that exposing the corruption was about more than clearing his name. It was about exposing a machine designed to crush hope and silence truth. Each moment of ridicule, each gavel strike, each unjust accusation built a tension that could only be resolved through revelation. When Elias rose from his wheelchair, badge in hand, it wasn't just a physical act, it was a symbolic resurrection of justice itself. The courtroom erupted into chaos, not merely because Elias revealed himself as a DOJ agent, but because he shattered the illusion that justice was untouchable. He exposed that beneath the robes, beneath the veneer of power, lay nothing but greed, arrogance, and vulnerability. His quiet strength dismantled the arrogance of those who believed themselves invincible. Through the stunning arrests and the unveiling of Prescott's meticulously hidden corruption, the story showed how easily justice could be manipulated, twisted, and weaponized by those trusted most to uphold it. The panic of Kimberly Chase, the frantic escape attempt, the betrayal revealed in every confiscated email and document, underscored the fragility of a system that operated in shadows. Elias forced the world to confront the ugly truth. Power unchecked leads inevitably to injustice. Yet the deeper lesson lay beyond merely exposing wrongdoing. Elias's confrontation with Prescott, his encounter with the elderly mother outside the courthouse, reminded everyone that justice is never about a single individual. It's about communities broken by a system indifferent to their suffering. It's about the powerless who stand alone, unheard and forgotten. Elias Munro became a voice for all those who had none, illuminating that real power lies not in titles or authority, but in courage and the relentless pursuit of truth. Ultimately, the story's pulse-pounding intensity serves as a call to action. It warns of complacency in the face of injustice and corruption. Elias's journey challenges each person watching to consider their role, whether as passive observers or active participants in demanding accountability from those entrusted with immense power. The collapse of Prescott's empire symbolized not an end, but a beginning, a warning that injustice thrives only in silence, that corruption flourishes only when decent people turn away. Elias's final pledge, his words echoing through the halls of power, underlined a critical truth. Justice is not passive. It must be fiercely guarded, courageously defended, relentlessly pursued. The message, crystal clear and sharply delivered, lingers long after Elias's final words fade. Justice is not a given. It's earned every day through bravery, integrity, and the courage to stand when others choose silence. If this powerful story of courage, justice, and standing up against corruption resonated with you, please hit the like button right now. Your support helps us spread these crucial messages even further. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on our upcoming stories, each packed with intense drama, breathtaking twists, and powerful lessons that deserve to be shared. Together, we can shine a spotlight on injustice and inspire real change. Join our community, comment your thoughts below, and remember, your voice matters. Thank you for watching, supporting, and believing in justice.